I'm Sherri, a CEO, speaker, coach, and author. As a business leader, I'm on a mission to empower women everywhere to embrace their most authentic self by challenging what you already know, then stretch to consider a different perspective. I share moments with people all over the world who are already on that path and are willing to share that perspective with me. Join me as we transparently consider this. Welcome back, everybody, to PrettyGirlsWork podcast, Consider This, where we have conversations that explore how we as women can empower one another to be our most authentic selves, and where we share practical ways to live that out authentically in our personal and professional lives. Each conversation will challenge us to think differently, to provoke the perspectives, think outside the box, and consider something differently. So let's get into it, and let's consider this. Well, y'all, this year has been a doozy. And let me say, thank God we're still here. And by being here, I think it just means that we have a responsibility for those who aren't. So let me just start off by saying this is going to be a little bit of a heavier podcast today. This is going to be a little bit of a heavier topic, but I think it's necessary. The state of affairs that we are in today in respect to racism is not new. But the intentional conversations, the way people are having intentional conversations right now, that is somewhat new. It's heightened. And some are coming at, having a conversation about racism from a very, innocent, can I talk, can I understand perspective. Others are having conversations about racism because their business demands it. Whatever the motive, whatever the reason, we want to know really and truly how to have conversations about racism. How do we do that? Well, today we are in a treat because my guest for today has been an educator for 19 years, but she's more than that. She's not just a teacher or an educator. She's an educator that cares. And if you understand what that even means on its own, you'd understand the gold that I just said. She's not just a teacher inside the classroom, but she wants her students to succeed outside the classroom, even more so than inside the classroom. She's a mentor. She's a guide to help navigate youth through life. She's a mother of 3 boys. She's a wife to a man who leads a nonprofit organization, a charitable organization, who also empowers youth through leadership development. She practices restorative justice from an Afro-Indigenous perspective, and she's just an all-around amazing person. I would love for you to please welcome with me to consider this conversation, Miss Skye Bowen. Hey! Yay! Thank you so much, Skye, for being here today. I just want to get into it. It's going to be a conversation. It's going to be a little heavy, but you know how we do. We talk it out and we keep it 100. The whole conversation has started now again. We've had this conversation before in the past, but it's never kept so consistent and hasn't been so globally pervasive. And I think that the fact that George Floyd, rest his soul, passed away, and in the way in which he's passed away was so shocking around the world that it's kind of like, okay, we know that we have a racism problem. We know it's been there for a while, but now we really have to do something about it. And it's really called for us to really have deeper conversations and a deeper look into history. And we know that there's been systemic racism for years, but now we have opportunity to make change, right? And I'm actually optimistic at this point. I've never been optimistic before. Today, I would say I'm at an optimistic state because I feel like there's more than just our community that are having conversation. There's more than just people from our community that are advocating to say, no, we need to make a change, or people that are stepping down from CEO positions and saying, I want my position to be for someone else. Like, there's just a lot more being done today. So how do we examine, the question I have right now, just to get it cracking, is how do we examine our way of thinking and just peel back the layers in conversation? How do we start doing that without being violent with our words, without being, attacking? Because that's a lot of what I hear these days. Like, well, I just, I don't want to be considered the bad guy, so I just don't say anything. But then silence is still speaking very loudly for you as well. So how do we start examining our way of thinking and peeling back the layers to even approach this conversation?
Mm. Yeah, well, first I want to say thank you, Sherri, for having me here this evening. And yes, it is a heavy topic, but it's an important topic, and it's something that I think a lot of us have bared the burden of for a very, very long time, and we just continue to kind of struggle through it. And I think what's happening now is we're realizing enough is enough. We shouldn't have to struggle to be able to achieve and accomplish what we want in life, as opposed to other people. And I think, one of the things that we have to recognize when we're having these conversations, and, when you refer to it as not being a violent conversation, is that I think the first thing is acknowledging the violence that has happened to our community, both Indigenous and Black communities, as well as other communities of color, where they have already been oppressed by the violence of words and actions that have been placed upon them. And so I think we need to first acknowledge that harm, acknowledge the harm that has been done by Indigenous communities, and acknowledge the harm that has been done by, years and years and generations of slavery and racism and social injustice, for us to be able to have these conversations. Yeah. And I think what's happened at this point in time is there's been a bit of a denial, over a lot of a denial, of the fact that there are still challenges with racism, whether it's subtle or overt, and that those things need to be dismantled. And by doing that, we have to recognize the harm that we have done to the First Peoples that were here and to the Black community before we're able to move forward.
Yeah. And so it's acknowledgement. That's where we start. We've got to start with at least acknowledging where we are right now and what has been done, the effect that it's had on us. Mm-hmm. I think that's important for sure. I think that when I think of racism, I think of it as so pervasive, and I've heard it described actually as white noise. I heard it one time being said that, racism is kind of like that background noise for us that's always been there. We see it, we know it, we hear it, we live with it. But for those that are just being what we would say woke, right, to the conversation, it's like, what's that noise? What? Is that really truly somebody's experience? No way. And I've had, even down to this summer, conversations with people who have been brought up with other races, specifically Black people, even though they weren't Black, and they just became aware of what those experiences felt like when she, particularly this white lady, went into a store with a biracial child and started getting looks. So she said, I was just made aware of, oh, wow, so this is the experience. And so someone who's actually been, you would think that, well, how could you not know that? You grew up in, this particular location. You had all of these people as your best friends. That doesn't necessarily help inform what's really truly going on in the society that we live in. So I guess for me, my next question would be, how do we overcome that in a conversation? How do Black and white or whomever start talking about racism and as you said, acknowledge, but how do we overcome the fact that you haven't been aware of systemic racism all this time? How so? How can that be? Because sometimes it seems very unbelievable. It seems kind of like, how could you have lived here, even in the United States or even in Canada, and not be completely aware? Yet I've met people that have been literally sleeping to the white noise that we've lived with, right? So, even in that kind of conversation, how do we get through that? How do we get over that barrier?
Well, I think the main thing with how racism operates is the position of power, right? And so when power benefits those who have been the oppressors, it's much more difficult to see that pattern of racism, right? Because it benefits them. And so, when I talk to educators and other people in corporations about racism and oppression, we talk about white supremacy culture and not about burning crosses and KKK, but about systems that operate to benefit white culture. And, when you look at, media and TV and books and magazines, like who is it that is centered in those places? Who's centered? Who operates in leadership positions in education and government? And so when those systems benefit those who are in power, and those positions tend to be positions that are for white people or white settlers, then it's very easy to be clouded because that system benefits you. And so when you come to that awareness that, you know, there is discrimination and racism and systemic racism that operates to prevent people of color from being able to have positions of power, that for them can be difficult to take, because they don't want to believe or accept the fact that they might have been complicit in racism at some point in time in life, right? Because they want to think, you know, I was doing everything right. They don't want to accept the fact that the system is not fair, and the system has not been a benefit for people of color, in particular Black and Indigenous.
Yeah. And I think that, I mean, coming to terms with that, I would say would be the first step in having a conversation with someone, coming to terms with the fact that this is the actual facts. These are the facts that we've been living with. And you may have just woken up to it, or you may have just realized that white noise has been going for the last over 100 something years, but it's there. So even when you say like it's in everything, like it's so true. I thought about that because, you know, racism as a social construct is deeply embedded within our day-to-day. Like, as you said, like the shows we watch, the books we read, like everything that we see. So how do we have, you know, if you've been, how do I say this? Yeah. How do we say, listen, your microaggressions to me as a Black person or with other Black people are racist? Because I think that the major part, the problem is we're afraid of saying that word because of the connotation and stigma that goes along with it. So when I say the word racist, I think someone hears what you said, like the cross on the lawn, or the Ku Klux Klan, or like such an extreme, like an incident that actually happened, not necessarily what happens in our education system or our economic system or political system or in business or, you know, in all these other places that it is very much embedded. We think of it as a stigma of I'm a bad person. How do we overcome that part to have an actual conversation about really the problem? Not, I mean, we can say, okay, there's a problem, but how do we overcome? Because a lot of people don't want to have these conversations because I don't want to come across as a racist. How do we overcome that?
So I think one of the challenges with that is just communication, right? And that, you know, a lot of people don't want to sit in any type of discomfort. And what I find challenging for that is, you know, as a Black woman, how many times have myself or other women of color been in positions where they have experienced racial trauma, where they've experienced these microaggressions, where they've experienced, you know, somebody touching their hair and saying, you know, how'd you get your hair like that? Yeah. All of these things that we continue to thrive through or try to survive through it. And yet when we want to have a difficult conversation about racism, you know, those same folks are like, no, that's comfortable for me. I don't want to talk about it. So I think we first need to address how we're communicating. And I oftentimes, you know, because there are so many people who have been so comfortable with how racism is so pervasive, but has benefited them, it's very difficult for them to want to have those uncomfortable conversations. Yeah. It's frustrating for a person of color who's like, yo, you know, we've experienced this like time and time again. Like, you need to invite that discomfort. You need to invite those conversations. And sometimes it's just sitting there and listening. It's not about trying to fix anything. It's about just listening and sitting in that discomfort and reflecting on what you need to do to like think about how to dismantle racism or how you've been complicit in the process.
Oh, I love that. I love that. And I love the fact that, you know, just sit there and listen. I think that's one of the things that we don't do enough. I don't think that we're active listeners. I think that we don't listen to understand. We listen to fix. We listen to defend. We don't always listen to just know. And I think that as well, would you say that even in this conversation of racism, that if we were more curious than we were defensive, that we would learn more and there'd be less barriers? Would you say that?
Absolutely. And I think that defensiveness comes from that, you know, that the term that was coined, white fragility, right? Like, that discomfort and not wanting to sit in it. And I think a lot of that also comes from colonialism and that colonial mindset of thinking that we have to do things in a certain way and that we're responsible for fixing it. And about, that even just that capitalist mindset of thinking, we're going to work hard. I've earned this position. Who are you to tell me that I'm not doing something right? Who are you to tell me that I shouldn't deserve and earn this position of power? And so I've seen many times where, a white person has been confronted even on their position to say, the best thing you could do is step down from that position and really allow that position to be in the hands of a person of color because of the work that you're doing. And they'll do anything and everything but want to address that, right? Because, for them, that's painful. That's hard, right? To hear from somebody, that you're not the one that's suited for a position and that you're supposed to step down from it, right? Like that's not an easy thing for anybody to take. Mm-hmm. But for a person of color, when they're addressing that, it comes from a place of, listen, this is enough. Like if we really want to do this work, you have to not be just aware, but you have to be able to take action. And sometimes action is sitting back and listening. And other times action is saying, I need to step out of this position and uplift a racialized leader into this position in order to allow the work to be done. Yeah, I agree. I think of as you were speaking, I was thinking of a time where someone was not chosen for a position. And I remember hearing the person say, I'm such a good person. Like, I don't understand why these things are happening to me. I would never think of someone like this, or I would never treat this person like this, and they were upset that they weren't given an opportunity. And I think about the fact that many times when we think about this conversation of racism, people feel like I'm a good person. I'm a moral person. So therefore I can't be racist, or I can't have any type of racist tendency. And I always say there are a lot of good people that are racist, not because you're good absolves you from being racist or having racist behaviors and tendencies. And again, it's not because you're a bad person. I think that there's a gap between what we internally believe and what we express. And I think that sometimes in that exchange, things could be lost. I think that as well, when we're talking about how to speak about racism, that needs to be kind of like just a little bit more self-reflection. So I would say for someone who's going to be speaking to someone, if you feel like you're a moral person, that's great. Go internally and think about, how do you show up for Black people? Or how do you show up for a person of color? How do you advocate at times? You're a good person, but how do you, and how have you? And if you don't experience, if you don't know what they've experienced, have you ever asked? I think that internal dialogue that sometimes we have, and vice versa as well, as a Black person, how does this white person feel? What are they going through? How can I connect with them so that we can build a bridge and have an actual conversation and gain understanding? I think, how do we close the gap, I guess is the question. How do we close the gap between what we believe about ourselves as good people and what we actually express? How do we do that so we can have these conversations? Yeah. So I think one of the things that's a challenge, and when I talk about restorative justice work, I've often seen it done in a way that's actually created more harm. And I think part of it is there is a lack of trust. There's a lack of commitment to building authentic and meaningful relationships. And there's a lack of really hearing the voices of those who need to be heard. And those three things, I think, have created roadblocks in addressing challenges with racism. And so oftentimes, if there is, a white person who will, shut down in a conversation with me, or, start crying to the point that we can't continue the conversation because, we have to address that more than dealing with the actual issue that's happening. Those kind of things can sabotage the ability to build and bridge that gap. And so I think one of the main things that needs to be done is understanding how to build those authentic relationships, because there is a significant lack of trust and therefore a lack of vulnerability, especially from people within the Black community, to address these things, because they have seen the harm that has been done before. And that pattern of systemic racism has led a lot of people to not feel comfortable or safe in really having these difficult conversations.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think, restorative justice in a lot of ways has done more damage oftentimes than good. But it's also because it hasn't really been rooted in the work of, Indigenous and Afro-Indigenous communities and how restorative justice really has been done in those communities.
Yeah.
And it colonize that practice to make it work for, a Eurocentric focus, like a lot of our curriculum, right? Mm-hmm. And so to bridge that gap, we need to be able to have meaningful, authentic, and real conversations that are difficult and be willing to unpack that.
Man, you're talking my language, okay? Because authenticity is something that is like a rare commodity these days. It is so easy for us to slip into Eurocentric colonialism because that's what we've been taught. Mm-hmm. But to actually embrace what's real and what's truly authentic, especially in this conversation of let's talk about racism, we're going to have to let go of some of that. Mm-hmm. And so that's one of the things that I'm taking away from what you're saying as well. Skye, thank you so much. We could talk about this forever.
I know. I was like, I have more to say too.
So thank you so much. I'm walking away with a lot more to consider. I'm hoping that our audience does as well. The depth of knowledge you have shared definitely always makes me feel better and always makes me want to be better. So I want to say thank you so much from the bottom of my heart. Mwah! Love you so much. How can we get in touch with you? What's your Instagram, or is there a place that we can connect with you?
Yeah, so Instagram, it's skye.bowen123, and Twitter is where I actually tweet out a lot of stuff, information. And there are, I just have to say, especially on this podcast, there are some beautiful Black women who have inspired me in the work that I do. People like Kika Ojo, Melissa Wilson. They're just phenomenal people. So when you follow me, you follow a lot of them as well, which I just want to attribute at least those two names. There's a lot that I'm forgetting, but there's beautiful Black women on there. But my Twitter account is at Healthy Miss MSB1. So at Healthy Miss B1.
At Healthy Miss B1. We will put that up there as well. We usually wrap up, consider this with one compelling or captivating thought. If there is one thought that you would like to leave with the audience about how to have conversations about racism, what would that be?
One thought, I would say, be willing to sit in discomfort in order to affect meaningful and authentic change.
Ouch. Ouch if you feel it. Raise your hand if you hear it. Thank you so much, Skye. Thank you so much for being here. Love you so much.
Love you too. Thank you. Bye.
Well, guys, this is another episode of Consider This with PrettyGirlsWork. Listen, family, racism is something that is going to take years to dismantle. Let's just understand that. Don't get tired. Get curious. And start having life-giving conversations that exchange empathy and love. Until next time, we want you to consider this. God bless you.